Hello, you fucks. Welcome to John Solo's Beard Brigade Storytime Fun Hour with 50% less boobs. We are starting a new story today. True Order by Patricia Logan. Yes, Tracy. Hey, by the way, I'm live in Discord too. Yes, I was asking which one to use for story time, but I made an executive decision, and I decided a prologue would be it. So, anyways, we got everybody in the background here. Little Patty Logan's in the back telling me what for. Tracy's in the background too. She's going to correct me if I make any mistakes, and we're going to record the prologue for this today. Now, this is book 4 in the series, which means, well, it's one more than 4 and one less than 5. It also means that there are spoilers ahead. So, if you don't want any spoilers for this series, that means you probably shouldn't listen any further, even though it is a prologue. But also, you're going to be getting a lot of stuff in here, that's going to spoil the previous book. So if you're not up to book 3 at least, somewhere in there, just get the fuck out of here. Don't watch this. This is going to be posted on YouTube, and I'm going to drop the link in our private Facebook group as well. So depending on where you're at there and fun stuff, you'll have to find the format accordingly. But anyways, understand that I'm going to mess up a lot today because I'm in kind of one of those moods. One of those moods, you ask? What kind of mood am I in? Boobs. That's what kind of... It turns out that a lot of the fans don't like it when I talk about boobs. It's amazing to me. Because they all have them, Except for Monty. Although I suspect that Monty has boobs too. They're just of a different variety. All right. You ready to go?
I'm ready.
Oh, I think I said this wrong when I was doing my morning coffee video. Barrister. That's totally different than a barrister, isn't it? I'm pretty sure it's supposed to be barrister. Is that correct?
That is correct.
That means a fancy time British lawyer, I think. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And cephalopod. And troglodytes. Got all sorts of them in here. All right. You know one of the funnest things about recording when the author's in the crowd too? The entire time the author's going, I can't believe I hired this fucking idiot. I can't believe how does he function? It's I don't know. I don't know. To be honest with you, I don't know why you're paying me. I'm not sure. You keep doing it though, so I'm gonna keep taking it. I mean, Prologue. Prosper Woods Chronicle, Letters to the Editor. As a visiting barrister from Great Britain, I find it my duty to write and say things are not as they seem at the Prosper Woods Courthouse. It's not at all okay to allow a first-year lawyer to call my elderly client an old fossil simply because I bring her to court in cephalopod form. Signed, Troglodytes Have Rights. I don't think so. I don't think a British accent, just because every single other letter to the editor hasn't had a British accent. So what I did was I just properified a bit of what I normally do with that. I thought about this. Plus my British accent sucks. There is that. Have rights. Romeo. Things had certainly changed in the last week or so. The moment I opened my eyes with Vincent blanketing my back, I sighed in relief. Feeling his hot breath at the back of my neck and the weight of the long legs tangled with mine grounding me when I needed something...
Stop.
I'm going back, don't you fucking worry. I opened my eyes with Vincent blanketing my back. I sighed in relief. Feeling his hot breath at the back of my neck and the weight of the long legs... Legs? Is that a word? I opened my eyes with Vincent blanketing my back. I sighed in relief. Feeling his hot breath at the back of my neck and the weight of the long legs tangled with mine grounded me when I needed grounding the most. He'd said things were about to get hairy in town, as if they weren't already with all the werewolves in our midst. I smiled to myself. Things had gotten hairy, metaphorically as well as literally. At least I was back in human form. Spending time as a tiny unicorn I forgot about that. Hairy, metaphorically as well as literally. At least I was back in human form. Spending time as a tiny unicorn hadn't been fun. But I honestly had to say if I had to do it all over again to get rid of the ghoul in our midst, I would. Catalina Broadmoor had been one sick bigot, and I certainly was glad to know my mate and I wouldn't have to deal with the likes of that snothead anymore. I was more concerned about the silence coming from Mayor Tommy Farrell. We'd heard nothing from him since everything had happened. The mayor had been taken to the hospital by his brother Sid, and the protesters had driven away from the bed and breakfast after Castor and Violet showed their true nature. Farrell had walked to his brother's VW cursing, holding his bleeding arm. I hadn't been able to get anything out of Sid, the town witch, and our close friends since that night. Then again, Sid had always been loyal to Vincent and me when it mattered. He'd shown up to save our lives and save the day many times over the last few months, and I wasn't going to push him when it came to getting information about Tommy. Even though I hadn't seen or spoken to my own half-brother John for years, I fundamentally understood the bond. Few months, and I wasn't going to push him when it came to getting information about Tommy. Even though I hadn't seen or spoken to my own half-brother John for years, I fundamentally understood the bond between brothers. It only made sense that Sid wouldn't talk about him out of shame or childhood love or whatever other bond they'd shared now or in the past. One more time. Few months, and I wasn't going to push him when it came to getting information about Tommy. Even though I hadn't seen or spoken to my own half-brother John for years, I fundamentally understood the bond between brothers. It only made sense that Sid wouldn't talk about him out of shame or childhood love or whatever other bond they had shared now or in the past. I trusted Sid with our lives and knew if he thought Tommy would pose more danger to us, he'd call just like he had when he'd felt the wards being put around her. I'm busted in the middle there. Trusted Sid with our lives and knew if he thought Tommy would pose more danger to us, he'd call just like he had when he'd felt the wards being put up around the bed and breakfast. Another bond I'd seen form only very recently was the one between Greg and Sam. Greg was the alpha of the Frederick werewolf pack, and his mate was Sam, also a werewolf. Vincent and I adored the two men who'd seemed suited for each other the moment we'd seen them together. As it turned out, we'd been right. They'd accepted each other as mates and fought together in our last battle with Sergio and his vampire coven, and the rogue werewolf pack Floyd had cobbled together. As it was, the vamp Vincent killed, Harvey Miller, had turned out to be Sergio's progeny. I snuggled back against Vincent. He sighed in his sleep, wrapping me tighter in his arms and brushing his lips across my neck. I smiled, knowing his fangs could pop through his gums at any moment. It made my dick hard just thinking about it. I really wished things weren't about to get hairy. Vincent's words. Gums at any moment. It made my dick hard just thinking about it. I really wished things weren't about to get hairy. Vincent's word, not mine. It had been 7 months since meeting my vampire, and some days it felt like we were riding one roller coaster after another. I wasn't stupid. The moment he'd explained who the Conclave of Eight were months ago. And some days it felt like we were riding one roller coaster after another. I wasn't stupid. The moment he'd explained who the Conclave of Eight. That's not so easy to say. And some days it felt like we were riding one roller coaster after another. I wasn't stupid. The moment he'd explained who the Conclave of Eight were months ago, I'd somehow known even then this day would come. How in the hell was I going to protect my town and the man I loved from a death sentence if these fuckers decided to take us all out? I realized I wasn't worried for myself. In fact, my safety hadn't crossed my mind. I knew I was powerful and had powers I hadn't even tapped into yet. I knew how to change my size, how to shrink spheres of purple light by focusing energy, and how to remove threats from an immediate area by relocating them. But I still had no idea how to create the lavender mist my son, the unicorn Prince Hannibal, had used on Floyd's rogue werewolves, stopping them in their tracks by disorienting and confusing them. -2 points to the author for writing shrinking spheres. Werewolves, stopping them in their tracks by disorienting and confusing them. Just say that out loud. Shrink spheres. Werewolves, stopping them in their tracks by disorienting and confusing them. And hadn't Hannibal said something about having the power to heal? I knew what I needed to do. First thing in the morning, I was going to talk to my son and become his student. I had a feeling the mist wasn't going to come to me as easily as the other powers had, and somehow knew our very lives would depend on how fast I learned. I felt my eyelids getting heavy. Knowing I was safe in Vincent's arms, I relaxed and slowly drifted back to sleep. I didn't enjoy my time as a tiny unicorn. Only in America. To sleep. Vincent. I tightened my arms around Romeo as he leaned back against my body. I felt the moment he woke up, sensing him getting horny. But then, before he acted on it...
Sensed him.
It's the same damn thing. It's a hard dig in my back. My arms around Romeo as he leaned back against my body. I felt the moment he woke up, sensed him getting horny. But then, before he acted on it, he'd slipped back into sleep almost effortlessly. Brushing my lips across his neck had my gums tingling. I heard the swish of his blood just beneath the skin, flowing through his veins like a river, driven by my lover's beautiful, kind heart. It would be so easy to simply drop my fangs and take what I needed from my unicorn, what I craved more than life itself. I stopped, stilling my body, biting back the urge to drop my fangs. What I craved more than life itself. I'd always known I'd lay down my life for Romeo. I'd fought mercenary werewolves and vicious vampires who'd come to kill me right by Romeo's side, caring not for my own safety. Had my life as a vampire always been this way? No, that I could easily say. I hadn't always been the man of honor I'd prided myself in being over the centuries. After my sire, Robert, had died the true death, I'd reverted to the honorable and noble man I'd once been, the human man I'd once been. The conclave of 8 were anything but noble and honorable. The vicious, heartless, soulless creatures, the oldest of our kind, had become evil over the millennia. I had no idea how old they truly were, but I knew Sergio was old as well. He might not be conclave of 8 old, but ancient nevertheless. Sergio had been a contemporary of Robert's. They'd grown up in neighboring villages, hunted and traded together when human, and had been made vampire within a few years of each other. They'd hunted together. As humans, they'd hunted game. As vampires, their quarry had been something entirely different. I had to remember that. When I'd first seen Sergio in my Prosper Woods store, I'd remembered the first time we'd met, in the 14th century. That hadn't been long after Robert's death. I'd been a very young vampire, newly made. Sergio had sought me out, introduced himself, told me of his and my maker's past, and asked casually about the books. At first, learning he had been made a contemporary of Robert's had been exciting for me.
Learning he'd been a contemporary.
You're very picky. My maker's past, and asked casually about the books. At first, learning he'd been a contemporary of Robert's had been exciting for me. I'd peppered him with questions about their childhood and the way they'd grown up together. He'd acted cordially, but it hadn't taken me long to realize that, though he'd answered each question with courtesy, he'd slyly managed to bring the topic of conversation around to the books, each and every time. It made me suspicious, and downright curious, or cautious. Curious or cautious, it's definitely a C word. It's not cocked. Topic of conversation around the books, each and every time. It made me suspicious, and downright cautious. That decision had most likely saved my life. I'd begun to recall everything Robert had ever told me about the books. They'd been given to him by a member of the Conclave of Eight for safekeeping, though the why of it had never been explained. Robert had said the books held secrets which could never be shared, and that I wasn't to worry about them. They were quite simply to be protected. Secrets which could never be shared, and that I wasn't to worry about them. They were quite simply to be protected if anything should ever happen to him. They were to be mine, never to be given away or traded upon, and then passed on to any progeny I had with the same promise. They were never to fall into the hands of another vampire. Things had to be done this way. No other explanation had ever been forthcoming, and I'd honored Robert's demand without question. I should have predicted the Spanish Inquisition, but no one saw it coming. Been forthcoming, and I'd honored Robert's demand without question. I should have predicted the Spanish vampire's reaction upon learning of Robert's death. Sergio had shown up afterward, peppered me with questions, and told me lies. Once I wasn't in the giving or sharing mood, Sergio had simply appealed to the Conclave of Eight. His request for ownership of the books, using the argument that I was too young and inexperienced to watch over such antiques, had been quashed without a trial, and in incredibly due haste. Back in the present, I glanced across the room at the bookcase. Had been quashed without a trial, and in incredibly due haste. Back in the present, I glanced across the room at the bookcase which now held the 8 tomes. Clearly the Conclave of Eight had no intention that anyone but me should own and protect these infernal books. I sighed, loosening my grip on my sleeping lover, as I realized what had to be done. Romeo wasn't going to like it, but if we and the residents of Prosper Woods were going to survive a visit from the old fuckers, as Romeo so adeptly called them, I was going to have to think and behave like them. I'd spent the last week since receiving the email going over and over in my head how to accomplish this disgusting idea. It made me sick to my stomach, but as I lay in bed with my lover, I decided on a path. There was only one way to get there from here. In order to do this, I was going to have to become one of them, get into their twisted, sick minds, go back into walking in the darkness, not only literal darkness, but metaphorical darkness as well. Fuck. I eased my arm from under Romeo and untangled our twined legs, rolling to my back and waiting for my lover's breathing to regulate. I needed some time alone to think, and didn't want to wake him more than he already was. Once I knew he had drifted back into a deep sleep, I slid out of the bed and dressed quickly, taking the elevator upstairs and leaving the house. Winter was only a month away, and it was cold, though I only felt the weather because I'd been lying in bed with Romeo so recently. My body temperature fluctuated by what was needed. When I was holding Romeo in my arms, my own body matched his sweet warmth. If I wanted to walk alone in the woods around my cabin, my body cooled to match the crisp night air around me. I stepped off the porch and looked up at the moon. It was November, and we lived high in the mountains in the gorgeous sequoia forest in Northern California. The moon would be large and round very soon. In less than a week our woods would be filled with the howls of werewolves for one dangerous night. It was a night each month when I chose to stay in with my mate. Romeo made a habit of closing down the sheriff's station before sunset on the night of the full moon, knowing that any emergency calls would be forwarded by way of Precious to either Sally or Dave. His deputies would call Romeo if things warranted the attention of the sheriff. I noticed that on past full moons, there were very few calls requiring Romeo's assistance. It seemed we weren't the only non-wolves who closed our homes up tight and stayed inside when the werewolves came out to run, hunt, and kill on the full moon. run, hunt, and kill on the full moon. I walked around the side of my house to a spot I generally avoided, pausing to stop where I'd buried Robert's bones when I'd come to Prosper Woods all those months ago. The upturned earth had since sprouted grass, and I remembered a time not too long ago.
Sprouted grass.
It's one damned letter. I'd buried Robert's bones when I'd come to Prosper Woods all those months ago. The upturned earth had since sprouted grass, and I remembered a time not too long ago when I'd stood in the yard watching Romeo run a gas-powered mower over the spot. He'd been oblivious to the ancient bones lying just beneath his boots. The smile on his face when he'd spotted me, just before I'd given in to the necessity of seeking darkness, had been brilliant. I'd only stepped out into the sun for a minute when I'd realized where he was running the mower. But as always, fatigue by exposure to daylight, I'd been into darkness had been brilliant. I'd only stepped out into the sun for a minute when I'd realized where he was running the mower. But as always, fatigued by exposure to daylight, I'd been forced downstairs to my secret bedroom to wait for him. He'd come in covered in a sheen of sweat, ready for a shower, and I'd tackled him. I can still remember how he'd laughed as I'm going to change that to could. Sweat, ready for a shower, and I'd tackled him. I could still remember how he'd laughed as I'd taken him to the carpet where I'd bitten into his perspiring flesh. His skin had been so hot, scented by the sun and cut grass and everything I'd loved about walking in daylight. Romeo was a shining beacon of my past life, my humanity. He was everything I'd ever wanted to have restored to me. I hadn't even realized what I'd missed out on until he'd run that mower over Robert's coffin and come into the house smelling alive. I stood looking down at the grass, which was now covered by a layer of dew that had solidified to frost overnight. By morning,
Now covered with a layer of dew.
coffin and come into the house smelling alive. I stood looking down at the grass, which was now covered with a layer of dew that had solidified to frost overnight. By morning, the sun would melt the ice, but by Thanksgiving, a few weeks from now, we'd see snow in these woods. Robert would be buried by one more layer, but that would eventually melt away in the spring, too. The grass would come back, but whether I'd be alive to see it remained a mystery. There was a very good chance Robert's bones would stay where they were for an eternity. If the conclave of eight decided to Robert's bones would stay where they were for an eternity. If the conclave of eight decided that I was to die the true death for killing Sergio's, Robert's for an eternity. If the conclave of eight decided that I was to die the true death for killing Sergio's progeny, he'd no doubt end up with Robert's books, and the bones would continue to be entombed. I was to die the true death for killing Sergio's progeny, he'd no doubt end up with Robert's books, and the bones would continue to be entombed in this very spot forever. I squatted and reached down, plucking a tiny daisy with yellow petals out of some small greenery. I'd seen these flowering plants all over California, but I'd never seen the small yellow blooms for sale in any stores anywhere. I lifted the flower to my nostrils and inhaled, knowing what I'd find. Absolutely no scent at all. I squeezed the stem and turned the flower over, staring at the white sap that congealed on the end of the hollow stem. I smiled slightly, touching the sap, remembering how Romeo had wrinkled his nose when I'd asked what the daisies were called. "They're not daisies, they're weeds called dandelions. They're nothing but a nuisance, Vincent. Most gardeners spend their Saturdays ripping them out of their garden, though. They're weeds called dandelions. They're nothing but a nuisance, Vincent. Most gardeners spend their Saturdays ripping them out of their garden. Though I hear some people eat their leaves. I never have. I always associate them with dog poo. I smiled, remembering how I'd laughed at that. Why dog poo? He turned to me and smirked. Because they are just as annoying as someone's lawn. People's lawns are annoying. Why dog poo? He turned to me and smirked. Because they are just as annoying on someone's lawn as dog poo. What do you say? I want to pause there. Because they are just as annoying on someone's lawn as dog poo. What do you say, Robert? Do you like my choice? Or do you think Romeo is too human? Back in the present, I stared down at the ground, knowing I'd get no answer from my sire. I knew the answer already. If Robert could reply, he'd tell me Romeo looked like food and suggest which veins he'd prefer dining from. Then he'd slap me, perhaps do worse, and curse my desire to hold on to my humanity. He'd always loathed it, forced me to do things to make me forget it. Robert had beaten me, starved me, denied me blood so long I'd wasted almost away to the words I should have said the first time around. I'm going to go back a bit more because I don't like the way I said humanity. Where's that pause? I knew the answer. How about right there? Stared down at the ground, knowing I'd get no answer from my sire. Stared down at the ground, knowing I'd get no answer from my sire. I knew the answer already. If Robert could reply, he'd tell me Romeo looked like food and suggest which veins he'd prefer dining from. Then he'd slap me, perhaps do worse, and curse my desire to hold on to my humanity. He'd always loathed it, forced me to do things to make me forget it. Robert had beaten me, starved me, denied me blood so long I'd wasted away almost to bones, and then turned me loose on the innocent, watching me drain entire villages of men, women, and children to satisfy my thirst and his evil. He'd laughed as I'd bathed in the blood of innocence. It was the way vampires were, he had always told me. His methods had worked. For a time, I'd become what I'd always feared. A creature of the night, with no soul, no heart, and no decency, driven only by bloodlust. I'd become evil personified, a child's death, a mother's nightmare, a father's terror. If we were going to survive what was coming when the Conclave of 8 came to Prosper Woods, I had to become that kind of vampire again. I dropped the flower and stood, turning on my heel and crushing it beneath my boot as I fled into the forest at vampire speed. And that would be it, the prologue to True Order, Prosper Woods Chronicles Book 4. It's out in ebook already. It'll be out in audiobook in about, I don't know, I'm not in charge of these things, probably a week, 10 days, somewhere in that range. So, you have fun, y'all. Peace out. I will see you a little bit later on this evening.